Well, welcome to Stormy 45, our building video. So we have the center lines marked on each of our deck support pieces, and we're ready to tack them in place with the CA, and then we'll add fillets with epoxy for more strength. Remember, we're not going to glue them across the whole length in the cockpit cutout, just at the very edges of that piece. And we've got all the fuzz cleaned off and all the tabs cleaned off, and we're ready to go. On these pieces, when you're cleaning off the tabs, don't angle the piece at all. Keep the edges square. It'll just be a little bit easier to glue them on with a square edge. Okay, so let's get going. We'll start down here. Just 2 dots on the small one would be plenty. When we get to the big ones, we'll do 3 dots probably. And then we can hit the piece it's attaching to with the accelerator. And use your center line marks to line those up exactly. I mean, you could just eyeball it with the outside edges, but the center line marks are just a little bit easier to use and get accurate. Okay. And I think on this one we'll just use 2 dots as well. Still good there. And using the center line dot mark to get that accurate. And if you felt your deck wasn't lying perfectly flat, you might want to be putting 3 dots on these so they hold the deck flat, but so far my deck seems very flat. I'll put 3 dots on this one though. Nice to get the fuzz off before you glue them on, it's so much easier. So a dot at each end, and a dot right on the center line. Now on these, we're back to the cockpit cutout. We don't want to put a dot on the center line because that would glue it to the rudder piece there. So we're just doing dots at the outside edges. In fact, I'll do the entire long strip there on the outside edges along where it's going to contact the deck piece, not the cutout. And same on this piece, just where it's going to touch out at the edges. There. Now let's go ahead and get the epoxy fillets on these, and we will just use 1 large mark, I think, which should do pretty well to start with. So we'll use 1 large mark of pre-thickened, and then we'll brush that on. 1 large mark of pre-thickened resin and 1 small mark of hardener. Brush that on, and then we'll mix phenolic powder in and do our fillets. Hey, let's add 2 more large marks, because I think for all these fillets that'll give us maybe just about enough. So 2 more large marks. Resin and 2 small marks of hardener. You can mix this right on top of what you had left in your pot. That looks just right. A little bit of sag, not very much though. These are really small fillets, so they shouldn't sag hardly at all. And time for a popsicle stick again. So there we go. Well, we finished the back fillet. Had just the right amount for that. And there's very little left in the pot. Really not enough to do anything with. So again, that's a good indicator for you about how thick to spread it. If you came out exactly the same, then you're doing great. If you ran out towards the end and didn't have enough for the last fillet and had to borrow some from another fillet, you're putting it on a little heavier than really is necessary. And so that's a good way to measure how you're doing. So again, don't let the fillets come out towards the edge. I'm going to push this one back just a little. Well, that one's okay. Because remember, you have to have an 1/8 of an inch at the edge all the way along for the shelf that we glued into the inside of the sides, so the deck can sit down on the shelf right here. And if the edge of your fillets is hitting that shelf and keeping the sides from coming in tight, that will be a nuisance. Okay, remember, put your brush up out of the pot so you can reuse your pot, and that's a wrap for the night. Okay, a quick note here. After putting my fillets on with the epoxy on the bottom piece, I noticed as it was starting to set up, but before it had gotten too far along setting up, I noticed there was a slight twist to the piece. Actually, the stern was twisting up that way, and the bow, when the bow was level. And I checked that with the square, and it was like, well, it wasn't very much of a twist, but I felt that at this point, if we locked the twist into the bottom piece, we'd be fighting that when we put the sides on, trying to get the twist straightened out. So while those epoxy fillets were still somewhat soft, I weighted it, as you can see here, with 2 blocks up front and 2 sanding blocks supporting the bow, and the front end level, and then I put a heavy little block of marble there, and then I twisted it out of position the opposite direction, with the idea that when it's set up it would spring back to being just level, and that worked. And so now this morning, when these fillets are totally hard now, I take off my weights, and this bow piece, when it's level, the stern here is also level. So we've gotten that twist out, but we've built several of these prototypes now, and the reason being that we start to see all the different variations that can happen in the building process. So we are going to recommend, I'll insert this earlier before I've glued everything up, we're going to recommend that you build this part of the bottom section, once you have it wired together, that you set it on the stand, that you build the stand before you do this process on the bottom with the fillets and the V-frames, that you build the stand, and that you set the stand on a very flat level surface, and that you then do your fillets and your V-floors with the bottom piece sitting on the frame, on the stand, and then you can weight it, delicately. You don't need a lot of weight, and then use, while it's on the stand, use the level to check, make sure everything is exactly true and that there's no twist being locked into the bottom piece by the fillets setting up. So just a slight change that will solve that issue and keep you from having to work around it later on in the building. Just a hint there, do your work on the stand. If you see any twist in the boat after you put the frames in, or before when you're checking it to make sure it's level, weight the side that's twisting up a little bit. And so in this case I would have weighted the stern side, which is down, and this side, which is up, and brought it true. And then the epoxy setting up would hold it true. Whereas as it is, I'm going to have to keep watching that, and I'll put a little bit of pressure on it or weight on it, even as we do more of the epoxy down the center line. Remember, your epoxy during the center line has skipped all the wire ties. In fact, this is a good time to clip our wire ties and take them out. Probably easiest to clip them from the inside, and you probably could use scissors on this, but wire snips are going to be easier because the very tip of a wire snip will cut the wire easily, whereas scissors, you might have trouble cutting it with the tip of the scissors, depending on what scissors you use. You could untwist them and pull them out too, but it's probably easier at this stage just to clip them and pull them out. Okay, once you clip it, it should pull right out. Pliers are probably easier, but they pull out pretty easily by hand too. So that's simple. So we'll go ahead and clip all these, and then tonight what we're working on is our 7A, 7B bulkhead, and the back deck support assembly, and the drake tail support, or the rudder support column here, this triangular piece. And you'll notice, in fact, you probably haven't done this yet, but there is a hole in the bottom back corner of the rudder support column, and that hole is probably filled up with epoxy from gluing those two pieces together, almost certainly. And so you want to go ahead and drill that out. I've already done that, because that hole, we'll take this back wire off and run a new wire that goes through both sides of the bottom piece and through the hole in the rudder support column. And you might notice that this really doesn't seem to fit at this point. It's the V of the bottom is much steeper than the cut on the bottom of the 7AB sections. Well, we're going to make that fit. That's the whole thing. That piece is going to change the shape of the boat back there, so flatten out the back end of the boat the way we want it to be. So this piece is correct. The boat in its present shape is not correct, and that is why we did not do the fillet down the center line all the way to the stern, because that shape is going to change. So I did mention we're going to take this back wire out, just the one wire, and we're going to leave the next three wires, 1, 2, 3, up to the V-frame 6. We're going to leave those in place because we need them to hold the boat together at this point. Okay, so let's get the wires out, and then we will get to move ahead to this frame. Okay, now we're all set. We have all the wires out. Some of them pulled out from the inside, some of them we clipped on the inside and then had to pull out from the outside. Any kind of little tool. I used a push pin to catch the edge underneath the wire and pop it out from the outside, in the cases where we pulled them out from the outside. And now we're ready to move on to this piece. Now this is one of the cases where it's kind of, once it's all together, it's easy. but it's kind of like you want to have one thing done, several things done at the same time. So the order of progression is important. If we we're going to hold the 7AB down to our lines tight against the bottom. That's important to get it all the way down tight against the bottom, because if it's up from the bottom like an 1/8 of an inch or even a 1/16 of an inch, other things won't fit as well. It'll make this the level for the deck too high, and it'll make the drake tail a different angle than it should be. So it's important to get the 7AB down all the way flush against the bottom. And so we'll use CA to get that to set off quickly while we hold it in place. And yet when we've got that in place, this rudder support column here is going to be touching right where we want to put our fillet for the bottom in. So we've actually got to put a fillet on the bottom there first, and then put our wire tie in, and then push the 7AB frame down to the bottom and CA tack it, and then we'll do our epoxy fillet along the 7AB frame, and then we'll do an epoxy fillet along the sides of the rudder support column as well, and then we will leave everything to set up. We might check it though after half an hour to make sure that CA hasn't released or something and our piece hasn't popped up and our boat changed shape. Okay, so I think that's kind of a good preview there. So we are going to be using a fair amount of force to change the shape of the back of the boat. And up at the front of the boat we have much more of a V. As the boat gets to the stern, the bottom flattens out quite a bit. And it'll take a moderate amount of force to get 7AB frame down tight to flatten out the hull at the back. Okay, so let's mix up. If we have extra epoxy too, we can go ahead and fill in where our wire ties were, filling the little wire tie holes and filling along the center line seam. And then we can fill between the wire ties at the back as well with on our center seam. And then we're going to check, and with all that new epoxy, we're going to check and make sure that we don't have a twist in the boat while that is setting up, that the boat isn't from front to back, isn't twisted one way or the other. And we'll, if there is any twist, we'll weight the boat appropriately so we have it set up straight and true. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll start with mixing epoxy. Remember, we're going to CA 7AB down, so don't get any epoxy there because the CA won't stick to wet epoxy, obviously. So the only place we're going to put epoxy now is underneath the rudder support column here, right along the center line, because once we have the 7AB, you know, this whole assembly together and glued in and down tight, we won't be able to get epoxy underneath the rudder support column in a very efficient way or adequate way. Okay, so let's just start with one large mark of pre-thickened epoxy, and that won't be enough for all the work we're doing, but it'll be more than what we want for the rudder support column. So I once had help mixing up epoxy, and it was a pretty big glue job actually, and the next morning I went to check the job and see how it turned out, and the epoxy was all exactly where I'd put it. There was no sag or anything, but it had not even started to get hard, and it was a moment's, it took me just a moment to realize what had happened. My assistant who had mixed up the epoxy had mixed it just the right consistency, but had forgotten to put any of the hardener in, and so it would never set up. So that was a bit of, I was a little dismayed at that because he was a very competent person generally. And so all that epoxy had to be scraped off and then mixed with hardener and then reapplied, and then it set off okay. We mixed a slightly warmer, a little bit more hardener into it because we knew some epoxy had soaked into the wood without any hardener in it. So we mix that batch with a little bit of extra hardener, but not very much. You can't add much without making the whole mixture less durable and less strong. One note that seems a little silly, but since it's happened in our shop twice, when you put these lids on, if you just set it on like that, it'll kind of stick on a little bit, or might have one thread or something. And somebody is inevitably, possibly yourself or somebody else, is going to grab this container and lift it up by the lid, and that lid's going to stay on just long enough until the container is over the carpet or someplace, and then the lid's going to fall off, and I can't even get this to go. And then the lid's going to fall off, and that whole thing's going to spill out. It's going to land upside down, of course. And so with the lids, it's good to put the lids on. So if the jar gets knocked over off the table or something, it doesn't spill. But don't put the lid on just half a turn or something. Put the lid on all the way. So if somebody picks it up by the lid, which is sort of an obvious thing to do, it's fixed up by the lid, it's not going to spill the entire contents of the jar. Okay, so that was one large mark, and now we need one small mark here of hardener. And again, with just one mark, I don't like to use that bottom mark because I don't think it's as accurate. So I pulled in 5 marks, small marks, and used one mark, and then put the rest of the marks back in the container. And I'm going to be mixing more hardener in a minute, so I'm actually just leaving that lid off for just a minute. And remember, it's easiest if you trim all your brushes at first. However, I haven't done that. So I'll get one more brush trimmed here. You will find that these brushes actually are much easier to use if you get good at trimming them fairly square across. Now this is, we're going to paint this on without thickening it any further. It's the pre-thickened resin. We're going to brush it on without thickening it any further initially, and then we'll thicken it to do a thickened fillet underneath the rudder support column. So up the sides of the rudder support column, along the bottom of the rudder support column, I'm going to keep away from the hole where I'm going to put my wire tie, because I don't want to be working with sticky epoxy and the wire tie at the same time. And then from that wire tie that you've left in place, but here I'm going to go all the way back over the wire ties because I don't want to leave a gap there at the back. So on this piece I stopped short of the wire tie. On the bottom pieces I went all the way back over the wire tie hole. Okay, but you do not want to put epoxy along here because you need the CA to grab hold there. And now the thicken, adding a little bit of phenolic powder here, and then we'll be able to get this into place. Funny how things always hide out of sight. Okay, so that's just about 1/3 of a spoonful. That looks just about right, creamy and smooth. Really a bit of sag, but not much sag. Okay. Now this project you sort of have to keep going with. You can't do part of it and then come back and do the rest. We're going to have to get the wire tie through and on. That's going to be a little sticky. Might not be a bad time for gloves on this project. And then you have to get the 7AB CA down. Okay, so now we have our epoxy fillet there, and we'll put this in place, we'll get our wire tie in place, and then we'll get 7AB down tight. I want to get the wire started first here. So putting the wire through the 7AB, through the rudder support column, and bend it down. So I'm aiming the wire ties towards those holes, which now I can't see because they're covered up with epoxy. There they are. I can feel them with the wire tips. So, oops. Make sure you're through the holes, not just down through the center line. Okay, that's good. And then this is a time we're going to start by hand. We're going to tighten this up a little bit more than we can probably get it by hand. So we have some flat tipped pliers here. But if you twist these wires very tight with pliers, they'll just snap right away. So you really don't go too far on it, or else you'll just have to grab another piece of wire. Then keep the two back parts of the hull lined up. I might be able to turn this so you can see it better. Turn the whole stand, in fact. Position. This is a good time to talk about the position of the rudder support column. You don't want it too far forward. Here's a popsicle stick. I don't mind getting sticky. If you put a popsicle stick right along the back edge of the rudder support column, that should land right at the outer edge of the bottom ply of the bottom pieces. So because that's going to help position the drake tail wraparound. So the drake tail wraparound will touch at the bottom edge of the bottom pieces and at the top edge of the deck that goes on top of this piece, actually. Okay, so that'll give you something to aim for there. So tighten the wire up. If it breaks, use another piece of wire. It might help to pull those pieces together while you tighten the wire too, so the wire's not doing all the work. Once you have the wire tight, it should be plenty strong enough to hold the pieces together. Okay, so make sure it's tight enough that it's pulling the two bottom pieces together tight. You don't want a gap there. And then we're going to flip it back over. And now we're ready for the CA and the 7AB piece. Let's flip it this way so you can see. Okay. Now this is where there's a fair amount of pressure involved. You can, before you get your CA on there, do a dry run. A few things, alignment things. You've got your center line. That should line up right with the center line between the two bottom pieces, where the two bottom pieces line up. Your 7AB should line up with the lines that you drew that are tangential to the four holes on the bottom piece. And you, when the center line's lined up, that should mean that your outside edges are lined up as well when it's pressed down into place. If the outside edges aren't lining up, you might fudge the center line just a little bit, but everything should line up accurately. And okay, I think we're ready to go. Okay, now we're going to do slightly more significant CA spots than we've used before, because there is a fair amount of pressure here. So a big dot there, one in the middle, and one at the top on both sides. Right between the two lines. Okay. And until we spritz that, we do have a few seconds. Okay, and then let's spritz it. And now you have to be really quick. Don't glue yourself into it. Okay? Check your alignment. That's important at this stage. No, I'm not quite perfect. Okay, abort on that one. And let's try that again. But it's just a little bit off my center line. It was pretty darn close, but yeah, I think we can do better. The big thing is that it be touching all the way down in the center. That's where it takes the most pressure. Don't have a gap right in the along the center line. And you could have somebody else helping you with this process. If you had a second person, you'd probably want to get it positioned and be holding it while they, well, you probably want to apply the CA, because you want the CA underneath your 7AB, not just along the sides. So you probably want to apply the CA, then push it into place, and then have the second person spritz the CA. And then you'd have a little bit longer to get your positioning right before the CA started to set up. And we do look really good now. The center line is exactly on. We're right between our lines, exactly lined up with the line that's further forwards. And the two bottom pieces are coming together tight at the back of the boat where our rudder support column is wired onto them. And so we're looking great here. And so far as I know, I'm not glued to the boat, which is a big advantage. The alignment is absolutely perfect now. Center line's dead on, and the two sides are coming down exactly right. You can see the how the rudder support column is sitting right down nicely into that epoxy, and the epoxy actually already formed sort of a fillet coming up the sides of the rudder support column, and the 7AB pieces are right down in the V. At the bottom of the V is where you're really paying attention to it. It's very tight down there to the bottom pieces, and so very successful in that setup. And now we'll mix epoxy for the fillet along the 7AB to the bottom, and for along the center line between the ties at the back, leaving those ties in place still, and then we'll fill in between the tie where we removed the ties going forwards in the boat. So let's go ahead and mix 2 large marks of epoxy at this point, and 2 small marks of hardener, and we'll start getting this finished up here. So we mixed our 2 large marks of epoxy resin with 2 small marks of hardener right on top of what we had in our container. And so that's fine. We haven't added any more phenolic powder yet, though. So this is a little bit thicker because we had a little bit of the mixture with the phenolic powder in it, but it's still not really thick. It's not thick enough for fillets. So we'll brush this on because it'll sink into the wood and saturate the wood better than a thicker mixture. So that little bit of the mixture that was in our pot already is not going to affect things enough to make any difference. We'll still get really good adhesion. I'm going to do a fairly big fillet on this back piece because we know there's a lot of load on it, just holding the boat to its proper shape. So, so quite a bit bigger fillet on this back piece than we've used on any of our earlier frames. And since we're doing a bigger fillet, we'll have to have a little bit more phenolic powder in there in the mixture because a bigger fillet's more likely to sag than a small fillet. And I'm just doing along the center line at the back, right up to the last wire tie, except for the one that's on our rudder support column. Okay, and that all looks good. Did we get all the way forwards? No, let's go all the way up here. You can just push a little bit into those drill holes. We'll also coat from the outside later on, but it's okay to get a fair amount of epoxy. You want to fill up those holes eventually. Okay, and then we'll mix phenolic powder in here. We'll start with about almost 3/4 of a spoonful of powder. And as I say, we want this to be just very slightly thicker because we're doing a slightly bigger fillet at the back. Now you're wondering how we do a bigger fillet, because the popsicle stick kind of does. That's still a little bit too, well, not too bad actually. Look at that tail, just really, really slowly, almost not moving. And that's just what we're looking for. See how that tail just is absorbing right back into the surface, perfectly smooth surface, after just a short time. So let's try this. It might be a little bit more liquid than we want, but I think it looks pretty good. And remember, one of the reasons we didn't have to put quite as much phenolic powder in as normal is that first batch of epoxy, that one large mark that we mixed up initially, has started to thicken up a little bit, and so that's why this is thick enough for that bigger fillet. If you're working in really warm conditions, you might have had to start a new pot if that first mark had gotten too thick. Doing a fillet behind 7AB2. We're using up a lot of this epoxy with the fillet because we want to, as I said, we want a pretty strong fillet here. And this time, for this bigger fillet, we're going to use the tip of the plastic spoon to create our fillet. And so we just take the plastic spoon and use the tip of it and slide it right along. And you can get variable sizes of fillet with the plastic spoon. By tipping it in deeper, you get a smaller fillet. By angling it more level, flatter, you get a larger fillet. And then take this excess material off the plastic spoon for your center line fills, and we'll see how far we get with this mixture. And then clean up the wood as well along the edges. Well, nobody's going to see these fillets. It's good practice because when we're gluing the sides on, there are places along the edge where those fillets will be visible. So, this is good practice getting the right mixture. That's the key, is getting the right mixture. Otherwise, if this is too thick, you're going to get little, every time you touch it, there'll be a little barb of epoxy, a little upright sort of hair of epoxy that stands up and won't sag back down into the smooth fillet. And so that's hard to deal with when you have it too thick. And it's no stronger. It's probably less strong, if anything. Okay, then doing our spoon fillet along behind. It's a slightly tighter fillet in the back, just because there's not quite as much room to get in there. You don't want to miss any of these holes through your boat. It's amazing how much water can come in through a small hole. And if you run out of epoxy, I've still got a little bit left, but not a lot. If we run out doing this filling job, we can come back and fill more later. Although we have got the clear coat on, it would be better to fill these now because we've already clear coated these areas. But we are going to have to fill back here where we pull these wire ties out as well. Let's see how far we can get. These are pretty small areas to fill, actually. We're doing pretty well so far. Between using the brush and the spoon together, you can get a little bit more out of your container, scraping it off your brush and then putting it onto the spoon and then getting it back on your brush in a convenient position on your brush. And will we make it? We're going to be very close here. I could steal a little bit out of my fillet at the back, but I'd rather not. And remember, we're still going to check for twist and maybe weight the boat a little bit if we see there's a bit of a twist that we're working to get rid of. And again, this is another time when it's a good gauge for you of how thick you're applying the epoxy, because this is coming out exactly to the last drop, just exactly right. So if you really just cannot get the last bit enough out of your container to get all the way forwards, you're probably putting it on heavier than you need to. Because I did this, you know, these center fills, you know, are fairly light, but I did a pretty significant fillet back here. So I got a little in my slot here, so I'll clean that up. I did a pretty significant fillet back here, and so if you're doing it heavier, if you ran out, you're going awfully heavy. I don't know how you'd run out really, but if you had a lot of extra, you're probably doing it a little bit light, and you might even go back at this point and add a little bit to your fillet or something. Although you don't want to mess with it. Once you get it in place, don't keep messing with it. It just, because it's starting to set up and it's not going to spread as smoothly once it starts to set up. So get it, you know, get it cleaned up, get your epoxy in place, get it cleaned up, and then don't mess with it. You're not going to get it better. You probably make it worse if you just keep at it. Once you get it cleaned up and neat, you're done. You add just a little bit to the center line back here. Just a little lighter than I want it there. Okay, and now sometimes the epoxy will come off these spoons, but you should have an extra one now for measuring, another one, separate one for measuring your phenolic powder. Okay, now the square, or the level, let's see how we're doing. We can go up here now and see, oh, that's perfectly level there. So how's our bow? We've got a bit of a twist to it there. So we're going to bring that back just a little bit. First we have to make sure the stern doesn't just twist with it. So we'll put a weight across there, and it's sitting in its stand. Fairly true. Let's get it there. And we'll check this again with the level. Okay, that's perfect. And then let's go forwards. And let me find the sanding block. It's just not right. No, it's not quite enough. That looks good. So it's not taking much to get it perfect. We'll keep doing this leveling, checking the level, making sure we get any, if there's any twist, we'll get it out. When we glue the sides on, we'll again be checking for any twist. But if we've done the initial layup with the floor frames and the center line with the stand and leveled it at that point, we shouldn't have any issues as we proceed. So the stand is going to be very useful to you in the building. Wow, nice. That went very, very smoothly and was easy. Really, we're doing some complicated work. That's one of the more complicated parts. I think wrapping the drake tail around is a little bit, you need to focus a little bit on that step as well. But this assembly and gluing this assembly, 7AB assembly, into the bottom is really one of certainly as difficult as anything you'll be doing. So congratulations on that step going smoothly. Okay, that's it for tonight. We'll let that set up. Fun, 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 fun. Okay, exciting. We get to put the sides on now. And just a little, it's not really difficult. It's a little fiddly, getting the sides lined up exactly right. But lots of time because we won't have any epoxy applied until we get everything lined up and ready to go. So the starting point is to wire the sides together at the bow and use the 4 holes with wire ties. And you can twist those wires fairly tight, although you don't want them so tight that the bow, that if your bevels are just right, then you can twist those wire ties quite tight. You don't want to be distorting the bow when it's opened up. It's fairly pointy though. It doesn't open up very far. So so I don't think you will have any trouble with those wire ties being too tight probably. Okay, and then the next step is we're going to use wire ties at the back corners of the sides where you have a hole through the 7AB bulkhead and through the back upper corner of the side. So just take 2 more wire ties for those places, and this is where it's a little bit tricky initially holding the sides in place so you can get these wire ties. Now the position of the sides at the back wants to be exactly lined up with the middle of the 7AB edge. So get the wire tie so it's holding the back edge of the side right to the middle edge of the 7AB bulkhead. And then you can tighten that wire tie up quite tight. If you get it too tight, it's going to break though, of course. Okay, and then the same on the second side. Okay, good start. Now the next thing is blue tape. We're going to hold the sides to the bottom initially with blue tape run from the side down under the bottom. And these pieces of blue tape will want to be about 5 inches long. It doesn't have to be too precise. So there's about 2.5 inches on the side and 2.5 inches underneath. 4 inches will probably be adequate as well though. So you won't be able to see, but I'm just going to take my blue tape, stick one edge. Let's move this out of the way momentarily. So I'm going to take my blue tape and stick one end to the table, and then just pull the roll out and clip it off about 4.5, 5 inches, something in that range. And we'll want 30 of these, so quite a bit of the blue tape. So just go ahead and give yourself, and you want them where you can reach them easily. Don't let them stick together though. And then when we're ready to put the sides together with the bottom, we'll have the tape ready at hand. Okay, so we'll go ahead and cut all those. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, let's start with our blue tape. Now the sides want to be outside of the bottom. Now once you have the front inside edges of the bow beveled, so the two pieces come together nicely and form a point at the front, and that bevels just with sandpaper as we saw before. Then use your wire ties through the 4 holes and wire tie the bow together. Those can be fairly tight once you have your bevels right, because the bow is a fairly sharp angle. The two pieces come together at a fairly sharp angle at the front of the boat, as you can see there. So those can be a fairly tight wire ties, although if your bevels aren't quite right, then you might be creating some deformation in the very front of the sides if you do those wire ties really tight. But if your bevels are fairly accurate, you can do those wire ties quite tight there. Okay, then we're going to be doing a wire tie at the back between 7AB bulkhead, the little hole at the top outside corners of the 7AB bulkhead, and the top back corner of the sides. There'll be a wire tie there. But before we put that wire tie in place, let's check and make sure the 7AB bulkhead is the right width for the boat. And you may want to sand that 7AB bulkhead down a little bit. A popsicle stick would be a good measuring tool at this point. So put the popsicle stick along the edge of the 7AB bulkhead and see if the popsicle stick, when it's lying right along the edge of the 7AB bulkhead, see if it also touches the edge of the side. It should touch the edge of the side. And in this case it's very close, but it's not quite making contact there. So I'm going to take my 80 grit sandpaper, and now in doing this I don't want to change the angle of the edge of the 7AB bulkhead. I just want to take it down evenly all the way down to the side. And I certainly don't want to change the shape of the bottom pieces, that curve. But I do want to make sure that there's not going to be a gap in there between the side and the bottom piece when it comes down. And this just takes a very little bit of sanding. Once you get it where you think it should be, check several times with your popsicle stick measuring gauge. Just a little bit more there. And that looks exactly right on there. Okay, and then get the other side as well. Okay, good. Now we're ready to attach our sides, and just sort of set it in place. This is a little fiddly initially, getting the sides started, but not really difficult, and no rush because you haven't spread any epoxy yet, so you can take your time on these steps and relax with them. So the first step, little wire ties, about 2.5 inches, 2 inches long, and poke them through the 7AB bulkhead hole, and then through the hole at the top back corner of the sides. And remember, the side does not sit on top of the bottom piece. It sits outside the bottom piece. So get the side positioned, and the side will want to come back to a point just exactly in the middle of the 7AB bulkhead. It doesn't overlap the entire 7AB bulkhead, just covers up half of the 7AB bulkhead. And get that tie, and then you can move to the other side and get the tie on the other side. And then we'll start applying our blue tape to hold the side in place relative to the bottom. Now, I don't think there's much possibility of getting the sides on upside down, but remember that there's a continuous shelf for the deck to sit on at the top edge of the sides, and on the bottom edge of the sides they're just the individual tabs spaced about 3 inches apart to align with the bottom of the boat. Okay, now once we have those wire ties in place, spread the middle, and it's probably easiest to do both sides simultaneously. Make sure the side is sitting outside of the bottom piece, and then what we're going to try to do is get a single tape in the middle of the boat to hold things fairly steady before we try to tape the rest. Okay, and make sure all the way along that the side is outside the bottom, and get that first piece of tape as tight as you can, holding the side in as tight as you can to the bottom. Okay, and then let's get one more piece here where it wants to pull inside too far, and again get that joint really tight between the side and the bottom. You can check. This is a good time to check before you've got too much tape on. Make sure you got that angle sanded correctly between the 7AB bulkhead and the bottom pieces. So look on the inside and see if there's a gap. When you push in on the side, is there any gap between the side where it meets the bottom? Is it being held out too far by the 7AB bulkhead not being at quite the right width? Or are you really tight there? And we are really tight. We did sand it just right. So that's nice. Now don't do too much on one side without doing the other side, because you want the boat to be developing evenly. You don't want to start creating a twist or any lopsided effect at this point. So line your tapes up on the second side with the tapes that you put on the first side. And again, pull this joint as tight as possible. Okay, and then a piece back here to mimic that other side. Now that you have the surf shape roughly established, you can pull those tapes quite tight as you stick them to the side of the boat quite tightly, and then wrap them underneath, pulling with quite a bit of pressure to get that tight joint between the sides and the bottom. So stick the tape. Now we're going to go. The first tapes, we were just trying to get them on there, and let's see. Let's do this where you can see it at least. The first tapes, we were just trying to get them on there with the side lined up relatively well. But now we can start to do a little bit even better work and a little more precisely. So now we're going to line our tapes up with each of our little spacer blocks that are going to help us align the sides to the bottom. So let's, instead of putting the tape just randomly, let's put a piece of tape right where our little spacer blocks are on the inside of the hull. And then we can stick it to the side, and then you can pull quite tight. I'm holding onto the frame on the inside of the boat. You can pull quite tight as you wrap it underneath and get a good tight joint there. And again, same on the other side. Make sure that the side is down far enough that it's not being held up by sitting on top of the bottom or something. So each of those little spacer blocks should be touching down to the edge of the bottom. Now at this point it's not so fiddly. It's pretty easy at this point. Let's check the back again and make sure we're lined up. Okay, on this side we're a little too far back. We're here, let's slide forward so you can see what we're doing. On this side we're a little too far back, so we're going to have to rework that side because we're completely covering the 7AB bulkhead, and in fact we've extended, the side is extending a little bit behind the 7AB bulkhead. On the port side we're just right, we're just covering half of the 7AB bulkhead. So we're going to release these tapes and slide this starboard side forwards just ever so much, just about a 1/16 of an inch, so we're centered on the 7AB bulkhead. So that's something you can watch for. Don't put quite so many pieces of tape on before you check that. So we'll slide that side forwards just enough that we're centered there on the 7AB bulkhead. If you have that wire tied too tight, that may make it harder to get the piece slid forwards the right amount. The side piece slid forwards. But it looks just right now. And it's important that the two sides be landing on the 7AB bulkhead the same way, or else one side will be shorter than the other and you'll be building a twist into your hull. And it won't be totally true. Okay, so check back again at the back corners. Make sure the 7AB bulkhead is only half covered up, and now we can let's get a couple more tapes up at the front, and then we're going to check the alignment of our bow to make sure the bow looks doesn't look lopsided or twist off to one side. So we'll get these two tapes on, and then we're going to check our bow alignment. Now look at the boat straight on from the bow, and let's see if that looks exactly true. Yeah, that looks very vertical. You're looking to make sure the bow looks vertical. You can use your center lines on your frames, your floor frames, to check. You can see all the way to the back of the boat and use that the rudder support column, which should be perfectly vertical. Make sure that the center line, the bow, is exactly lined up vertically, perpendicular with the horizontal. And that looks very true. This is a good time to check and make sure everything looks true and exact. Now let's put it back on our, let's check one more way. Let's put it back on our stand and check with our level. So we'll level the back, and then we'll try our level up here at the front. And it looks pretty good. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so at this point you want to make sure you don't have any twists in your hull. Okay, and then more tape, and we'll have it totally stable and ready for epoxy. Now looking on the inside, we have most of it taped, but I'm just noticing that and everything looks very tight, except right next to 1, 2, 3, the third V-frame, there's just a little bit of a gap there where the side is being held out by the edge of the V-frame coming out just the slightest bit farther than the bottom. Now that would have been a little bit easier to take off before putting a tape on. But I'm just going to go in with the tip of a mat knife and slice off that very outer edge of that V-frame where it's causing a bit of a conflict there. However, hopefully you're watching this whole step before you start to do any of the work, and so sandpaper, sanding that V-frame, the number 3 V-frame, back just a teensy little bit, so there's no chance. But it came off quite easily with the Olfa mat knife. These are such a great tool. Once you use one of these, you'll never go back to a regular mat knife. You can find them online if you just Google Olfa, O-L-F-A, and when you buy the knife, it's apropos to buy a set of blades and extra replacement blades at the same time, and then you have years of use from it. Okay, now I think everything should be super tight. That's real nice, and we'll finish up one piece of tape at each of the spacer blocks, and our initial pieces of tape are just extra, but we'll just leave those in place. And this front piece of tape will go right underneath and wrap up the second side. So that'll be held tight. And again, let's do a more thorough check now as far as the boat being true and not having any twist. And now we'll do a slightly more thorough check to make sure we have everything true and no twist. Check all along the inside, make sure your positioning blocks are down against the top edge of the bottom pieces. Check the 7AB frames, make sure that your side pieces are not too far back or too far forwards. They should just be covering up half of the 7AB frame on the edge. And then let's check for twist. Now we'll use several tools here. We'll use the level, and we'll use a square on the table. So use your level at the back, right across the back deck support, and get that exactly level. And we're using, the stand is really useful at this point. So that's exactly level. And now let's check our table, see if our table's level. The table is exactly level. Okay. And we're using the level parallel to the way we use the level at the back of the boat, so we get true readings. And now we're going to take our square and sight from in front of the boat. The square can be on the table because the table is level and the back of the boat is level. And now let's see if our bow is exactly plumb. We're off, we're very close. You wouldn't be able to see it really without the square, but we're off just a little bit. So we're going to want to twist our bow just a little bit towards the camera and see if we can get it to hold in that position. Now that looks very nice. That looks really square there. So I'm going to take my pliers and tighten up these wire ties just a little bit more now to hold the bow exactly that way. Good. Now the next step is to do a trial fit of the deck. You have to start the deck, you have to pry the sides apart and start the deck. I'm starting the deck about 2 or 3 inches forwards of where it's going to sit in the back, and that looks like it's going to fit right in there nicely. And now you can see the front of the deck won't fit in until we slide it back, to slide your deck back. Okay, now we're going to check. Now we're going to check that everything is true and square. We'll use we've slid the deck in place. It had to start forwards about 2 inches from where it's going to end up, and then you pry the sides apart, get the back deck down, and then start to slide it back, and it'll slide back. It doesn't quite line up with the back deck support at the back edge of the boat, but on the inside cut, inside this hatch piece, that'll line up with the front edge of the back deck support piece. Remember, the drake tail is such an angle that the deck is a little bit forwards of the back deck support piece. So line it up looking in right in this groove here, this cut here. The back deck support piece underneath should line up exactly with the inside edge of the cutout. And then the bow should drop right down, and yes, we have a perfect fit at the bow as well, and everything looks really true. So now let's check our alignment again. Let's get the boat sitting so the back, make sure the back deck is down flat, and put your level across there, across the back deck. Okay, and that's level. Check your level on the table, and then use the square to sight from the front of the boat to make sure your bow is lined up true. And that looks good. So we're in good shape there. So excellent. Looks like we're ready to spread our epoxy fillets on the inside of the boat to hold the sides to the bottom, and we are moving towards having a real boat here. So exciting progress. So let's pull our deck out. Remember, while those epoxy fillets holding the sides to the bottom are setting up, and we'll also be doing fillets holding the sides to the 7AB bulkhead, while those epoxy fillets are setting up, it's critical, it's absolutely critical that the deck be in place. We're not going to glue the deck on at this point, but the deck must be in place while those side fillets are setting up, or else the boat will be totally the wrong shape and the deck will never fit on, because the sides will be too close, too far in. The deck will not fit in. Okay, so the deck must go in, back in. We're going to slide it forwards to remove it. The deck must go back in as soon as we put the fillets along the sides. Okay, make sure your tape is on there firmly. It should be fine. You need to have rubbed it on, fairly firmly, but you really, if you're really having trouble with the tape sticking, you could rub it on like with the edge of one of the plastic spoons rubbing against the tape, or some somewhat round surface rubbing against the tape. But if you rub the tape on too tight, then when you pull it off, you're going to disrupt the surface grain of the wood a little bit, and you'll have more sanding to do to get back to a smooth surface. There are two types of blue tape, though. Unfortunately, the standard one is the one that you see here, and typically it has, and it's 3M blue tape. Typically it has a blue and white and with black printing on the inside sleeve, cardboard sleeve on the inside, the tube that's wrapped around there. And this is the multi-purpose painter's tape. There is another tape that looks similar. This is slightly crenellated. The other tape looks similar, but it doesn't have the crenellations. Crenellations are little wrinkles on the surface of the tape which let you wrap it, curve it around surfaces more easily. And the other tape has an orange, typically has an orange and blue inner coloring on the inner surface of the tube it's wrapped around, and it says for light sticking applications, where it's the adhesive is not nearly as tenuous as the adhesive on this tape. It removes more easily, and that tape may not really is not suitable for this job. You may find it's really not holding on tight enough. So get the standard multi-purpose painter's tape, not the easily removed painter's tape with the the lighter duty adhesive. Okay, so now we are ready to move ahead and get our epoxy mixed up, and this is going to be a fairly big glue job, so you don't want to be interrupted during the middle of it, and we'll be mixing a larger amounts of epoxy, so it's easier if it's not too warm in your workspace. 70 degrees would be ideal. If it's over 80 degrees, you're going to have to be awfully fast to get this job done in time before the epoxy starts to set up. So you might wait till a cooler part of the day to do this job. And remember that the epoxy in the container, in your mixing container, is going to set up a lot faster than the epoxy once it's out of the mixing container and spread out thinner, because the larger mass of epoxy in the mixing container will generate its own heat as it starts to set off, and that heat accelerates the setting off process and generates more heat, so you get into a chain reaction that accelerates and keeps accelerating itself more and more, so you can have your epoxy set off in the container and get so hot that you can't touch it. So on this larger batch, cooler time of day is and don't get interrupted, and keep going and get it out. Get the epoxy out of your container into approximately the right areas of the boat, and then you can finesse your fillets a little bit more once the epoxy is out of your container. Okay. Oh, and let's see, one last note. At the bow, it'll be nice to get epoxy in the bow itself. So what we're going to do is start with the bow, and we're going to mix up a small batch of epoxy, just one large mark of the pre-thickened. Then we're going to coat the inside of the bow. Then we'll add phenolic powder. We'll remove our wire ties, coat the inside of the bow, add phenolic powder, and then we're going to put our wire ties back, and then add phenolic powder, put the mixture inside between the two halves of the sides, and then we'll put our wire ties back in place, and then we'll mix up our big batch and do our fillets all along the sides and the bottom and up the sides at the 7AB bulkhead, and then we'll slide our deck into place quickly, and then we'll check the alignment again, and at that point we will let it all set up. So that gives you a little bit of preview. If we didn't take our wire ties off the bow, we wouldn't really be getting epoxy between the bow pieces, the two side pieces at the bow. So it's nice to get, that area. And those wire ties are going to be pretty well cemented in there. We may be able to pull them out. Epoxy doesn't stick all that well to copper-based metals, so we may still be able to pull them out. If we can't, we can just sand them off flush on the outside and leave the wire tie in place. Oh, and that does remind me, we do still have wire ties at the back along the center line. Those last four wire ties, yes. So we're going to clip those before we mix up any epoxy. Let's clip those and pull the wires out, and then we'll probably have we'll have quite a bit of extra epoxy from that one large mark that we mix up for the bow. So we'll use that extra epoxy on the center line where we've just pulled out those last four wire ties. And then without pause, we will continue and mix up the big batch of epoxy to glue the sides to the bottom. Okay, so that's a preview, and we will get started. Before we clip those wire ties at the bow though, let's put a piece of tape right at the bow underneath, so we don't all of a sudden have things flying apart. We don't want to lose all our alignment and all the where the sides are taped to the bottom so nicely now. So here we'll put this tape right up here at the bow. Let's mix our epoxy first, and then we'll clip those wire ties and do our epoxy between the two bow pieces. Oh, just a quick note, when you look down at the bow, straight down, there may be a little bit of a gap between the very front tip of the bottom pieces where they come together and the front of the sides where they come together. Not to worry about that. That's intended just a little leeway there, and that'll fill with epoxy. No problem at all. Okay, so the bottom piece is just less than 1/4 of an inch. The tip of the bottom piece is less than 1/4 of an inch back from where the sides meet at the front. Not a problem. Okay, one large mark of epoxy of pre-thickened resin, and one small mark of hardener. Actually, I'm working in a cool enough space, so I'm not too worried about timing until I mix the large batch. Then I will be a little bit more alert to the timing aspect of this. But before mixing this, you probably want to clip those back ties and pull them out so you're ready to use that epoxy. And then we'll mix the epoxy, and then we'll pull out the front ties. So 3 of those ties should pull out pretty easily. You just clip one side of the tie and it pulls right out. This back tie is pretty firmly ensconced in the epoxy and underneath the rudder support column. So my guess is it won't pull out. We'll just end up sanding it off flush, breaking it off and sanding it off flush. However, we can see if it pulls out, that's great. If it doesn't, that's fine as well. Yeah, as I suspected, it's just going to snap right off there, which is fine. Get it to break off as close to being flush as possible, and then the rest will sand off. Okay. Now we'll do the bow, and then we'll have to remember to do those the center line at the back where we pulled out the 3 wires. And let's stir our epoxy up. This has not got any phenolic powder in it yet, because we do want it to saturate the wood. Now we've run our brush with the pre-thickened epoxy mixture, but without any phenolic powder. We've run our brush down inside the bow 2 sides pieces and gotten that coated with the pre-thickened resin, but without thickening it with phenolic powder more, so it'll soak into the wood quite nicely. And then we've done the same with the pre-thickened resin over our holes and the gaps in the center line where the wire ties we just pulled out. And now we'll mix in the pre-thickened phenolic powder, just about a little less than half a spoonful. We don't need this to be very thick. Just a little bit of powder in there, and because it's not going to sag, because it'll be flat, horizontal at the back, and between the bow pieces it's going to be sort of contained, squeezed in between there. So this can be a slightly thinner mixture, but we don't want a lot of sag. Okay, and we'll try to get that all the way down to the bottom, even though the pieces are a little tighter together at the bottom, and a little bit more at the back edge of where you've beveled the pieces than at the front edge. At the front edge, the pieces will be tight together. There's no room for a lot of epoxy. At the back edge, we'll start creating a bit of a thicker fillet at the back edge, although we'll add to that subsequently as well. We'll add more to that later on. And then the wire ties go back in. We'll need 4 more wire ties, and we'll tighten those up quite a lot now to pull that bow together tight. Now that we have we don't want to pull it so tight that we suck the sides in behind the bow, but we do want the front to be a nice tight joint. And again, we'll check our alignment to make sure that we, when you're wiring these together, start at the top, I would suggest. When you're wiring these together, hold your bow where you think it's vertical, so you're not creating a twist to your boat or getting your bow off center to start with. If we need to, and you can tell by having the sides level at the top edges. If we need to redo this, because when we check with our square we find there's something off, we're going to do one tie though, quite tight, and then we're going to check our level before we do the other ties. So here's our level. Let's check our level back here, and we're off a little bit there, so let's get that. There we go, that's level. And then let's check our level here as well. We're off a little bit there. That's level now. So we might have to put a little weight on this side when it's setting up. We'll check it again later. And we know our table's level because, oh, and the bow is perfect. That's right on. Okay, so we got that first wire tie exactly right. And it's holding everything square. So let's go ahead and do our other wire ties. Of course, these are poking right through the epoxy, but that's okay. If they get glued in, that's fine, or you can use the trick with epoxy gets soft when it's heated to a hot enough temperature, and so you could use the trick where you put a soldering iron against the wire tie, heat it up and pull it out of the epoxy, although that's possibly a little risky. You don't want to burn the wood. And alternatively, you can just clip the wire ties off tight or break them off up against the surface and then sand them smooth on the outside and leave the wire tie in place is fine. The copper will last as long as the boat lasts. Yeah, it should be easy enough to find the holes to poke your wire tie through, since you know they are lined up perfectly. And these probably really want to be tighter than you can get them with your fingers. So using a pair of pliers with a square nose will work well tightening those up. Okay, and again, let's do our check. Okay, level at the back, and we are right on, perfectly square. So that's great. And check this level up here again. That's pretty close, a little bit high on this side. Oops. not very much different. We'll check that again after we get our fillets in. Okay, now we're ready for our big glue up. Oh, and I did go ahead and get the center line back here, so you want to make sure you got that. Check the bow. Yeah, that looks very nice. Lots of totally full. There's no light showing through no gap here at the bow, and the epoxy's coming back a little bit, creating a very small fillet, just back about 1/8 of an inch from where the two pieces join together. There is still a gap down right at the bow, right in this area, and we might be able to squeeze that together a little more with tape. Let's try that. But again, the epoxy, it's a very small gap, and the epoxy is going to fill it. But we'll try to see if we can squeeze that together even more now that we've got the epoxy in there. Okay, so we'll get some pressure on it, and then wrap our tape up on the second side. The tape's stuck firmly on the first side. Get a little pressure on it, and wrap the tape up as tightly as possible. That does. Now I don't see any light through there. That does pull it together nicely. Okay, so that's worth putting that last tape on there. It's going to be a little hard getting the epoxy. We can remove this tape now. It's not doing anything. And but it was helpful having this tape across the top here at the bow when we clipped those wire ties. Otherwise our bow would have sprung apart and might have caused a problem with our tapes farther back. If we'd lost everything, it would have been a setback. Okay, so that tape across the top was fairly loose because we wanted the bow to separate enough we could get our brush in between the two halves of the bow, but we didn't want the bow to sprung wide open. Okay, and that looks great. Okay, so these corners may want a little more tape too. Let's hit those corners with tape because I can see a little bit of light through there. So we're going to tape against the corner, right on the corner there, and see if we can pull that in all the way tight. That looks much better there. Okay, so that tape I had here wasn't quite far enough back to keep that corner in tight. So doubling up the tape back here is a good plan. Yeah, that's very tight now. Okay, and check at the top where you have your wire ties. I could tighten this wire tie just a little bit. This one looks very snug and tight, but I'm going to tighten this wire tie just a little bit. Pull that side in so there's no gap there at all. So I'm holding the side in while I tighten the wire, so the wire won't have to pull it in, it's just going to be holding it in. Okay, and that looks totally tight now. And check our alignment of the sides. They should be covering up half of the 7AB bulkhead, but not the entire thing. Although it'd be hard to change that alignment at this point. Okay, everything looks good. Ready for our big epoxy fillets to complete the sides. You can just mix the new epoxy right on top of what's left of that one large mark. There's not much left in there at this point. And let's see, I'm guessing that we'll want at least 4 large marks per side. So let's start, but don't mix 8 large marks because it'll start setting off on you. It's usually a better plan. You think, well, I don't want to stop in the middle and mix another 4 large marks because, you know, I'm rushing and the first 4 marks are setting off in place, you know, on the sides. But remember that the marks will be setting off more slowly once they're spread, once they're out of the pot and on the sides. So rather than mix 8 large marks to start with, we'll mix 4 and see how that works for the first side, and then we'll mix an additional 4 for the second side if we need that much more. Yeah, just one note on this, when you're pulling the resin into the syringe, you have to make sure you don't suck air in, because that'll throw off your mixture, the amount of resin you've got. So often you have to move the, if you think you have air in, squirt the epoxy out and pull new epoxy in. Sometimes with the pre-thicken you have to move the tip of the syringe around in the material, in the epoxy, because otherwise you'll form a crater. Now, I got quite a bit of air in that time, so I'm going to pull it all out. If you have a big bubble of air, you might only have 3 marks. You think you have 4 marks, and you might only have 3 marks. And also make sure that the epoxy is filled all the way to the top of the plunger, because sometimes you'll have a sort of a vacuum at the top of the plunger, just underneath the plunger, and you won't, if you pull the epoxy, the syringe out of the epoxy too early, you won't have filled your quota either. Okay, so that was 4 large marks, so 4 small marks of hardener. Don't short the hardener. I mean, don't give it a whole extra mark, but don't ever be short of hardener. Now this is a larger batch, so you want to mix it a little bit longer. And remember, we're going to use before we add phenolic powder, we're going to spread this to saturate the wood, this mixture, about 1/2 inch in from the edge along the bottom pieces and 1/2 inch up from the joint along the side pieces. And I'm going to use this mixture on both sides before I start my filleting. So we will, and start at the back. You want to go up the 7AB piece, but you don't want to glue the deck on at this point. If you get a little bit of epoxy too far up on the 7AB piece and glue the deck on, you might break the deck when you try to remove the deck later on. We do not want the deck glued on. Now we're using this first mixture, this first batch, on both sides, the pre-thickened with the resin, but there is no phenolic powder added yet because we want to saturate the wood. It's a little hard to get up in the bow cavity there, but not impossible. And I just got a little epoxy on the edge where the deck is going to set down, so I want to be sure I get that off, because otherwise our deck will get glued on. If you do glue the deck on even in just one little place, it might split the deck when you try to pull the deck off later on. So we want to be very careful about not having any epoxy where it's going to glue the deck on. This is probably the area where you're at most risk, up here in the bow where you're trying to get a brush down into the front area. Okay, or back at 7AB, bulkhead might be another area to be careful at. So we're coming up the sides about 1/2 inch and onto the bottom piece about 1/2 inch. And in the middle of the boat, we're being a little bit neater, because where the cockpit opening is, you're going to see the sides. Inside the cockpit, you'll see the sides. So we'll try to have a fairly clean line where this epoxy, doesn't go up above a fairly clean line, 1/2 inch up the sides. Because the wood tone may be a little bit different with different applications of epoxy and varnish and such. But up here in the bow, just go at it, no concerns at all. You won't ever see this. A little harder spreading it around the stiffeners on the side, but just use a little bit, nobody will ever see it, so use a little bit more epoxy up there. Make sure you don't miss anywhere. When I tip this, I'm not sure you'll see it. Maybe you can see it now. I would not tip it when you're doing it because you don't want to lose your alignment. But if probably can't see that even tipped. Yeah, maybe you can see that. So this is the area where you're going to be seeing the bottom edge of the sides in this area where the cockpit cutout is. And so a little bit neater along here. Makes me a little nervous tipping it like that. That was just so you could see a little bit better. But I don't want to get my boat out of alignment by leaving it that way. I'm finding as I spread the epoxy right here, I'm getting a little bit of separation between the hull and the bottom, so I'm going to add another tape, intermediate tape there, and maybe one right here too, just to hold everything in tight. Any place you can see light shining through between the two pieces, add a piece of tape there to hold everything tight together. And there, I think we have it everywhere. Good. Clean up my line along here a little more. Good. And now let's see how much we've got left here. Now we really don't have enough to get very far with a fillet, so let's add another 4 of pre-thickened resin, and we'll start our fillets then with that slightly larger batch so we don't run out right away. So we're doing another 4 pre-thickened resin. This pre-thickened resin, you have to pull into the syringe a little bit more slowly, or else you're just going to suck air. Now with these larger batches of resin, it's not a bad idea to get a pair of gloves on at this point. Although if you're careful, you can probably do it without. But as you get more resin around, you have to be more careful. Okay, and then 4 small marks of hardener. And mix that up thoroughly. This is starting to be a larger batch of epoxy, so you'll have to work a little bit more quickly to make sure this doesn't go off. So stir it up quickly. We're adding phenolic powder right away on this for our fillet, and we'll be doing this fillet with the plastic spoon because we want a fairly significant fillet here. And we'll get the so that's a fairly heaping teaspoon of phenolic powder, full spoon heaping up. So it was probably almost twice as much as a level spoon would be, and that's probably just the start. We're not that won't give us a thick enough mixture for a good fillet yet. So it's still very runny, totally runny. So we'll do another heaping teaspoon. And that should get us closer to the right mixture. And it's still too much sag for a big fillet. You can see how it's just running right off the brush. So a little bit less this time. Still pretty, more than a level teaspoon probably, but not quite as heaping as before. And we'll see how we're doing there. Now we want to mix the phenolic powder kind of gently at first, because you don't want it puffing up in the air where you might breathe it. You don't want to breathe the stuff. That's getting better. You see it hangs on there fairly long, but it still comes off as a big glob. So about half a teaspoon, not slightly heaping, about half a teaspoon there. Then we've been close to 1 full level teaspoon if you measured it that way. We definitely do not want this dry and hard to mix, hard to spread. That looks about right. See how that is sagging a little bit. Maybe we'll, since this is a fairly large fillet, we'll just add a teensy bit more, about 1/4 teaspoon. Okay, now that looks pretty nice. That's a big glob, and you can see it's, you know, it's sagging a little bit gradually, but it's holding on there pretty good. Okay, that probably wouldn't hit the table before it's set up. It might, but it's pretty much going to set up on the brush like that. Okay, and now we're not going to start doing our fillet until we've got most of this epoxy in place. We're starting with it up the 7AB, and we're going to move the camera around here so you can see better. Okay, so we're starting with the placing epoxy up the 7AB side joint, and now we're just going to place it. We're not going to do a fillet, we're just going to place the epoxy along the side joint with the bottom, because the goal now is just get it out of your container before it starts to set up. And I'm actually going to work forwards along both sides instead of, that's a slightly different plan. Instead of doing one side and then the other, I'm going to work forwards along both sides. That'll be easier for me. When we've got all this epoxy out of the container, then we'll spread this fillet neatly and clean it up, and then we'll mix as much more epoxy as we need to complete the job. You'll find in cleaning up a fillet, you actually get quite a bit of extra epoxy when you clean off the epoxy along both sides of the fillet, and you can run the fillet, you know, you can continue your fillet with that extra epoxy. Now, you have to brush both ways around your placement tabs, or else you'll leave a little gap in airspace caused by the epoxy brushing over the tab and not filling in behind it. So at each tab, brush from the front and from the back. Now we're getting up into the area where the fillet will actually be visible, and we want it to be neater, so this midships area is where you want to spread it as neatly as possible. And that brings us up to frame 1, 2, 3, 4. So almost a midships. And that's pretty much all we've got in here. Although when we do our fillet and clean off the edges, we'll be able to run that forwards a little bit farther. Now let's come in a little bit closer so you can see the filleting process a little bit more closely. Okay, first we'll run our fillet up the 7AB. Remember, don't take it up above the wire though. And then we'll run our fillet. Okay, so that's all pretty well cleaned up. We'll mix one more batch of 4 large marks and 4 small marks of hardener, and with phenolic powder, and I think that should finish it all up. And we'll go all the way up to the bow. Try to, at the very bow, try to get a little blob of epoxy right at the front corner to add a little strength there, and I think you'll be in good shape. Try to have the middle part of the fillet as clean as possible in along here, where that'll be visible, and you can even use a paper towel to wipe off any excess epoxy you get on the farther up the sides than you want it along there. Okay, now we did have just the right amount with that additional 4 marks. And if you're finding that you're always using running short of using the amount that we've indicated, you're probably putting on quite a bit more than you need. This is phenomenally strong material, and So you don't really need very much of it to have a very strong boat. So just using extra is not going to make it stronger, just heavier and not quite as neat. And I think you'll find it, you know, just a more pleasing material to work with if you don't just overdo everything. Now there are a couple of details now. One is, as an afterthought, I thought let's put a piece of tape along the side where that part of the side is exposed above the floorboards and not covered by the interior furnitures, and it's visible in the cockpit cutout, this area. So that will clean when I pull that off. Well, actually we can pull it off now, actually. And we'll have a straight line along there rather than you know, more erratic line. So that's something you might want to do before you start spreading any epoxy. Just before you even mix the epoxy, just put the tape on each side along there, and then this is a good time to pull it off because it'll come off easily now without having epoxy on top of it. And then in that area along here, try to get your fillet as smooth as possible. Part of getting a fillet smooth is having the right mixture to start with. If the mixture is too dry and sticky, it'll be hard to get it. It won't slump back into its smooth surface. You'll have, you know, sort of barbs and lumps and stuff rather than just a smooth fillet surface. And then this last step is important. We don't want any epoxy on top of these the V floor frames, because we want the floorboards to sit down neatly on top of those. So let's clean off those floor frames, and then the last step, critical step, is putting the deck in place. Otherwise this will set up and create a boat that's too narrow. The deck will never fit on. So don't forget to put your deck on. And so clean off the epoxy all the way to the outside edges on these floor frames. So you're all the way across the floor frame, as long as the entire flat area of the floor frame should not have any epoxy on it, or else your floorboards won't fit down nicely. They'll be held up by lumps of epoxy, or you'll need to sand or something. Okay, there. Now the last step, critical. You absolutely cannot, don't walk away without doing this step. You must put the deck in place, because you can see it. If the side's set up like that, the deck doesn't fit at all. So again, have the deck about 2 or 3 inches forwards of its final position. Pull the sides apart, get the deck in place there, and slide that deck back. Not quite flush at the back edge. Let's take a look at that now, because we do want this to be exactly right at this point. So let's come back here where you can see clearly, and so the deck should not be flush at the back edge. We'll zoom in a little bit there. Okay, that'll give you a better view. And so what we want is, we want the deck to be flush on the inside surface here. And that's looking about right there. So right at the inside surface of this back hatch cutout, the deck should be flush. And now let's check that. So our drake tail piece is going to come up along here, and we need a new popsicle stick for that measurement. So our drake tail piece is going to come up along the back, and we can go back just a teensy bit more, but not very much. There. And let's see how that looks for the drake tail piece. Yeah, now the drake tail piece comes up along the rudder, the sloped back edge of the rudder support column piece, and just just exactly touches the back edge of the deck there. If the deck's too far back, it'll disrupt our drake tail piece, and the drake tail piece won't fit as smoothly. And then working all the way forward, pushing the deck down against the deck support ledge, and then any place the deck is not tight, the sides are not tight against the deck, put a piece of tape across. Let's see if you can see this up front here. Any place the deck is not tight with the sides, put a piece of tape across from side to side to pull the sides in there. I mean, it fits pretty nicely without the tape, but there was a bit of a gap here. This is all pretty tight along here. I might put a piece of tape right in here just to hold it a little bit tighter. Well, it's really not bowing out very much there. Okay. So there. This all looks good along here. I can pull that in just a little bit at the very back, right at the wire ties actually. Although it's pretty darn snug there, but it's coming in just a little teensy bit, which may change. I want to pull this tape up at this angle. Okay. And this first side does look, this side towards the camera does look tight already. So right here we don't need tape, otherwise we'd run an angled piece of tape. And now this side is pulled in tight there. And looks good here at the bow. We're going to pull that together a little bit. And then I think we're going to be good. Go up here to the bow. It always looks so much neater to cut the tape rather than tearing it, but when you need a piece of tape quickly, it's fine to tear it. And now we're going to do our test to make sure we're true and level and everything, that we don't have an inherent twist in our boat. So let's get our level and zoom out just a little bit. Okay, and check the back level. You get that setting so it's level. So it's level. Okay, level there. Check it up here. This side's just a little bit high. That's looking good. Level there. Deck down. And then at the very front, see if you can see this up at the front. Here at the front, let's check with our square, make sure our bow is plumb. That looks perfect. Very nice. Okay. Everything's together tight here, tight all the way along, level here, level there, and yep, looks very good. So I think it's time to leave it alone to set up, and we've got a boat. Very nice. Coming right along. Good job on that part. That was a bigger glue up job, but really goes very smoothly. Really doesn't have any particular challenges in doing that except making it as neat as possible. So very nice job. What a beautiful boat. Good. We'll be back when that's all set up.